I'm Joe Tato. I'm a partner at DLA Piper, and I'm the co-chair of our Global Energy Group. I've worked in Africa for 24 years, which was unusual as an American back then, and worked in my early years for government and for parastatals, and now more recently for U.S. sponsors and private equity groups investing throughout the continent. We've got a great panel here today to talk about the importance of the U.S.-Africa relationship. And so I'll just briefly introduce the panel and then throw out a couple of topics. We'll have some statements by the panel and then hope to have some interaction with you. Zaria Tabawa Wako is from the Uganda Energy Regulatory Authority, and she is substituting for Irene Maloney. Wimamuna, who is a senior advisor to the Ministry of Energy in Ghana and former CEO of Ghana Gridco. No stranger to AEF, for those of you who've worked in Africa for a long time. Paul Hinks, the CEO of Symbian Power, a very successful U.S. power developer. Peter Ballinger, who's substituting for Lynn today, Lynn Tabernacki, and Peter's with OPIC. Richard Nelson, our Deputy Coordinator for Power Africa, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for Richard. And last but certainly not least, Enos Banda, who's had a distinguished career in Africa. I got to know Enos a bit when he was at ESCOM. He's now the CEO of Energy Group, and I know his perspective is one that we all value. Just a couple of thoughts for those of you who may not be aware of some of the recent developments outside of the noise that comes out of Washington nowadays, is the extension of AGOA, extension and reauthorization of Millennium Challenge, more TDA programs, OPIC with a substantial mandate to invest in sub-Saharan Africa, the BUILD Act, which is pending before Congress, all of which I think, again, outside of the noise that we all hear, shows a commitment to the United States. But I think what's important initially is how do our colleagues in sub-Saharan Africa feel about that? What's the importance of the relationship between the United States and Africa? Zaria, would you like to start with that?
Thank you. Zaria Wako, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Electricity Regulatory Authority, and I'm standing in for Honorable Irene Maloney. Thank you, moderator. I think that couldn't be a question today, but maybe because of the different perceptions that we've had with changing in administration and governments in Washington. But we've benefited and enjoyed in this partnership. And I believe as Africa, we need this partnership not only strengthened, but targeting outcomes in the form of impact. I think the area usually which becomes very unclear is the lead time, but also the capacities and the capabilities of the developing countries to understand how the projects and programs are being packaged so that they can be exploited to the benefit of the population. But if you ask me the importance, it's really very, very important. And our desire is that, of course, for not benchmarking, is that we learn so that we can embrace these programs for the benefit of our continent. Indeed, we are on the journey of averting the situation of referring to Africa as a darker continent, and the energy sector is also core and a fuel to economic development. And I don't see any mature development partner that can be supportive given the background that USA has supported us. So affirmatively, I can say it's very, very important. The desire is to grow it more warmer, more stronger, more targeting more outcomes and output so that we make impact so that we transit from the darker continent to a continent that is lit. We can transit from developing economies to developed economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaria. Richard, you're on the spot.
Okay. We'll jump in. Before I jump into the substance, I'm going to put a plug in for the Women in African Power lunch that is at 1 o'clock down at the Paradis conference room. I would encourage all of you to go there. I'm going to be leaving right from here to go over there. The theme is going to be from concept to commercial success, how she built it. It's going to be actually quite interesting, so I'd encourage all of you to make your way there for a nice lunch after this. All right.
Why don't you talk a little bit about Power Africa, where it came from and where it is now, with a lot of the accomplishments and the bridges that you've built. I'll make one comment and then I'll keep quiet. From the American perspective, I think the creation of Power Africa and its programs has created a lot of interest in the United States. It's really put Africa on the mark for investors that heretofore had not thought of Africa. So it's had a lot of, in my view, emotional and longer term impacts than what we might see immediately, but it's been a tremendous program.
Thank you. Let me start by just making a declarative statement that the U.S. is very, very interested in seeing Africa develop. The administration is very, very much behind seeing Africa grow and develop to become a real player in the world's economy, collectively as a continent, to create opportunities for them and for U.S. companies as well, and for, frankly, the entire world. Let me get to the Power Africa story this way. With the change in administration that occurred over a year ago, there were several initiatives that were involved in Africa that were under the microscope. And over the last year and a half, there's been a significant evaluation process looking at these different initiatives and what we're doing in Africa. And several of the most important ones have made it through and have full support, Power Africa being one of those. Let me mention the others just briefly. The PEPFAR program, the U.S. government's program to fight HIV/AIDS. They are spending $3.3 billion a year in Africa. And since inception over the last 15 years, they've spent more than $40 billion in Africa. That is continuing. That has crossed administrations a few times now. That demonstrates a commitment on the health front. They are continuing our Young African Leaders program, YALI. That is bringing over 700 young African leaders to the U.S. every year to provide training and exposure to U.S. In U.S. education systems. And we're providing assistance to about that many more on the continent in regional leadership centers. Our Feed the Future program on the agriculture front just received a $1 billion earmark for the year. They're spending, 8 of the 12 focus countries in Feed the Future are in Africa. So the U.S. government as a whole is continuing to provide substantial support in Africa. The Power Africa program, which is interesting, the others are more traditional foreign assistance type programs. Power Africa is leading the way in creating real commercial opportunities and creating a real middle class. It's more leading the way on the economic front because power is the fundamental aspect of all economic growth. Power Africa got started 5 years ago, and initially it was launched with much fanfare, stating that the U.S. government was committing $7 billion toward this effort to double access to power in sub-Saharan Africa by creating 30,000 new megawatts of power by 2030 and creating 60 million new connections, which we translate to about 300 million individuals or people getting access to power by 2030. That commitment hasn't changed. We are continuing to work toward those goals. We're continuing to spend funding every year through each of the 12 U.S. government agencies that make up Power Africa to make that difference and to reach that goal. We just, as I mentioned, went through this very substantial review process with the administration over the last year. And through that process, we have come through with, as I mentioned, very strong support from the administration. We are now branding ourselves, at least internally, Power Africa 2.0. We are continuing to work toward our generation objective, our connections objective, and our enabling environment objectives. But now the focus is going to be more on the latter two. We're going to be focusing more on connections, more on the enabling environment. So in connections side, transmission, distribution, and off-grid. So that's going to be a little more of a stronger area of focus for us. But we're still doing what we did before. Also, through this process, we are going to be tracking and trying to help U.S. companies become better aware of the opportunities that exist in Africa. We're still going to be providing assistance to companies across the board, whether they're U.S. or not. But we are going to be doing, through some of our agencies, OPIC, USTDA, Department of Commerce, reaching out a little more to companies in the U.S. to just let them know what's going on in Africa and how they might get involved. So we're eager and excited to enter into this new phase to strengthen the commercial and the political relationships that we have with countries throughout Africa. And I'll stop there. That sort of gets us going. Okay.
Thanks, Richard. Enos, what do you think about this topic?
Thanks. Thanks, Joe. Energy is a new company. We were established in December last year, but while we are a startup, we bring the pedigree of 7 assets in 5 African countries, 1 in South Africa, 2 in Kenya, and 2 in Ghana, 1 in Nigeria, and 1 in Cape Verde. So we are invested in about 1.8 gigawatts of electricity infrastructure, power generation infrastructure. So the company was established through a combination of the assets of 2 African funds and financial institutions, AFC and Harith. And it is African-led. I'm a South African. So for us, this conversation about the relationship between Africa and the USA, we are coming at it as a private sector participant in the energy market, looking at how the United States, as an economy from government and the private sector, how we could engage better and what the challenges and the opportunities are. In my mind, I mean, I studied in the U.S. and sort of have some understanding of how things are done there. I practiced law there historically. So one of the challenges that standing on this side of the equation that we see is that the U.S. is a country whose constitution and the way that the administration works believes in equal opportunity and equal access. And it is a pull environment where things are made available, and those who are capable and those who are willing, those with the capacity, go and shake the tree, and they're able to, gain benefit. So there is an assumption, a presumption in the U.S. system and the frame of reference that assumes that the recipient of the benefit of U.S. resources and U.S. engagement understands where to go and how to put it together and to make it happen. And we believe that that level of knowledge and the requirement for understanding the U.S. processes has created an opportunity for competitor countries, such as China, to come into the African continent and do things differently because they are a push country. They define the problem and they define the solution and package it and say, all you have to do is press this button. It's an easier approach from a short-term interest standpoint. However, I believe that the very things that make access to U.S. resources and capability difficult are the very elements that make the U.S. relationship with the African continent attractive in terms of the sustainable long future, because it has to start with deepening the knowledge and capacity of the recipient countries or entities that will engage with the U.S. Government or private sector system. Which means that once you see U.S. involvement in the energy sector, it means there is a certain level of knowledge, the impartation of knowledge that happens, that it then creates a sustainable network and system going forward. So to Richard here to my left, and I've spoken a lot with Peter as well, and other times, I want to repeat a simple saying that says, sometimes we say you feed a person, you give a man a fish, you feed him once. You teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Our version at Anergy is that, give us a fish first so we can fill our stomachs, and then teach us how to fish so that we can focus because we're not hungry. And I think that is a principle that you can think about in terms of how the U.S. engagement with Africa can be better improved. Start with the knowledge base, start with dealing with the urgent issues, and then introduce this element of the independence of interaction that we can deal with. We are confident, though, from an energy perspective, that we have the understanding and the tools to intermediate between the market and the U.S. environment in terms of how energy can be done into the future, and we look forward to that engagement. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Enos. Paul, could you give us a private perspective from private power and someone who's invested throughout the continent for many years on the importance of this relationship? It's fundamental to your company.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for saying that Symbion's successful, because it doesn't always feel like that for me.
Success is measured in different ways.
There's an incredible... First of all, I would say that when we talk about Africa in the United States, or we talk about Africa in general, we all know it's 54 countries. And there are different conditions, different circumstances in each country. There are some I wouldn't go anywhere near. There are many that we would. And there are many that other investors I know in the United States, power developers who are working all over Latin America, the Caribbean, North America, no matter what I tell them, they will not come to Africa. So why is that? Well, that's, I think, because of one of the things I just mentioned is the problems that you face when you work in there. The investors do not like uncertainty. They want to sign a contract, which in this case would be a power purchase agreement. They want to invest their money, and they want everything to go right if they do their job. The problem that, and it's not just Africa, by the way, where this happens, but the problem that, or the perception that US investors have is that something's going to go wrong. So, for example, it doesn't help when, it's no secret because it's been all over the news, that Symbion has a big dispute in Tanzania with TANESCO. And I thought when we went there, there's no possibility we can have a dispute with TANESCO. I've been working there since 1982, and I know everybody, and nothing can go wrong. Guess what? We end up in a dispute. We've got 120 megawatts sitting there, not doing anything. That becomes public. Everywhere I go, they say to me, "Why are you still in Africa? What's wrong with you?" Right? But I do. I continue. I'm looking at new projects now. We've, since that, invested in Madagascar. We're investing in Rwanda. We're looking again at Nigeria. So that's because I believe I understand the risks much more than other people. But the real point here is that there must be more capital, pools of capital in the United States to invest in Africa than anywhere else in the world. So why are we not seeing more than, I'm talking about large players of large megawatt space load, why are we not seeing huge participation from everybody? And I personally think it's what I think Richard just described as the enabling environment. And whilst I'm doing it, I'm more of a risk taker. Enos is doing it. He's more of a risk taker. But there's so many companies that would be in Africa if we could just solve this issue of uncertainty and being able to deliver on your power purchase agreement.
Well, I mean, that's a really good perspective, Paul, because before I started to work in Africa, I worked in Latin America for 6 years. And there are many issues there as well, but it just seems that things go a little smoother in terms of investments for U.S. investors. But there is a substantial body of U.S. investment into sub-Saharan Africa in many ways, not only in power projects directly, but also in goods and services in the power sector as well. But I think the perception, and that's why I think Power Africa is so important in trying to change that perception. You have these issues in virtually every emerging market. And if you step back and you're someone who is a bolder risk taker like you and Enos and try to really understand it, you can have a lot of success.
I can give you another example. We went to Madagascar. Everybody in the US told me, you're mad. You know, we've got a dispute in Tanzania, you're going to Madagascar now. The reputation of the utility there is bad, they won't pay you. We did our own due diligence, we met people from the government, and I thought, I think it's worth it, we'll take a risk. So we invested, we didn't raise any debt, we got an equity partner and we did it with all equity. And guess what? It's the best paying utility we've ever worked for. So
Well, you did your diligence. That's why. That's why.
it was good due diligence.
William, could you give us and the audience your perspective on the U.S.-Africa relationship, particularly with regard to Ghana and the West African region?
Okay, thank you very much. Ghana, we have dealt with virtually everybody. We've dealt with Americans, we've dealt with Europeans, the Chinese, and of course, Enos is here, African, and also investing in Ghana. So that means that we virtually are dealing with every part of the globe. We've dealt with Australians as well. Now, with regards to the partnership with US, it's been very positive. We used to rely solely on hydro, but with time, demand was going up, and we realized that we had to diversify on our energy mix. We had to go into thermal generation. The Americans were very involved. We had no problems. So far as I'm concerned, I've worked in the power sector for 33 years, starting as an assistant engineer and rising to CEO of the grid company, dealing with all manner of people. And I think the partnership has been very, very good. Now, we started off when I was a young engineer in 1985. Access to electricity in Ghana was 21%. Today, it's 85%. So that means, dealing with the various stakeholders, we've been able to bring it up. I always have this interesting joke, and that is there is this map. These days I don't see it. When you go for conferences, then they show Africa being very dark, and then the rest of the world lit. And I would always say that Africans know how to conserve energy. So when we are sleeping, we knock off all the lights. So of course, but these days I think we are not conserving energy. So Africa is getting more and more brighter than at night. So maybe we have to go back to energy conservation. Yeah, but it's been good. Of late, what we have gone through with the United States is that our distribution network, the last mile, has not been efficient. That is a major problem we have now. some of the infrastructure has been in there since 1965. Now, we have had this arrangement with MCC, Millennium Challenge Corporation, where they are sponsoring a concessionaire to take over the distribution network. In fact, we are about done with selecting the concessionaire, and by next year, the concessionaire will come in to manage our distribution network. The other part of the partnership that I have enjoyed personally is that through the Edison Institute, every year a number of CEOs from Africa are sent to the US to meet very successful CEOs from the US. We exchange ideas, and I think that is very good. That was really very positive. They tend to understand us, especially when they want to undertake investments in Africa. And we also tend to understand the kind of practices over there, best practices that we can emulate and then make our systems better. So my answer is that yes, the relationship has been very positive, and I hope it continues.
Well, thank you, William. I appreciate your reference to the Edison Electric Institute, because I actually taught courses there for African regulators for 2 or 3 years. It was rewarding for me to be able to make that contribution, but I think I hope that it was very helpful to those regulators. And people forget about those other contributions that the U.S. tends to make. Peter Ballinger, Managing Director at OPIC. You've got all the cash for these investments.
Well, and hopefully we're getting more.
And you'll hear about that through the build-out.
Exactly. And Richard talked about the larger, more broad U.S. Africa relationship. I want to focus a little bit more on some of the tools that are in the toolbox, many of which Power Africa leverages. And I know this is an energy conference, but commerce, OPIC, USTDA, Exim Bank, we do a lot more than just energy. I mean, for OPIC in Africa, it's 40% of our portfolio, but we do low-income housing, educational institutes, the Young Leadership Academy, for example, we financed, student housing, hotels, agribusiness, food processing, all sorts of things. So we're not just an energy company, although I do think we're important to it. Let me back up and talk about some of the other dimensions of the commercial relationship between the U.S. and Africa. I think one of the larger ones is the U.S. Department of Commerce. Under the last administration, they doubled the number of commercial service offices in Africa. So that is important, and that was at a time of budget cuts. Where there's not a full-fledged commercial service office, for example, here in Mauritius, the Department of Commerce has worked with the Department of State to create what we call partnership posts. So Paul Stempel, for example, who's in the back, is the economic officer at our embassy in Port Louis, and he represents the Department of Commerce in addition to his State Department job. So in almost every country in Africa, there is a commercially oriented officer with local staff that can assist American investors and also African business people who are looking perhaps for an American partner. So that is a key business development tool for all of us, and that's very important. Next is the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, which, as you know, does feasibility studies, reverse trade missions, all sorts of things that set up the projects so that financing companies like OPIC, private sector banks, investors, have real-time information on projects across the board that help them evaluate whether it's a good investment risk. Exim Bank, which is under a little bit of political pressure in the U.S., is still making loans. We hope that they will be reauthorized very soon, and then they'll get back into business. But they're an important player and have been in the energy sector. So we're very much looking forward to them coming back into the fold. OPIC is the U.S. government's development finance institution. When I moved to South Africa about 5 years ago, Africa was 7 or 8% of our portfolio, global portfolio. It's now about 24 to 25%. I can't take much credit for that. It's been all of these initiatives, including Power Africa, and the focus on Africa and the commercial relationship that has helped that. But that means that Africa is probably close to the largest region in our global portfolio. We offer project finance, like most development banks, political risk insurance to help de-risk projects, and then we support private equity funds like Denham, for example, that make investments in companies here in Africa. So those are our three strong tools. Joe referenced the BUILD Act, and I can never remember what it actually stands for, but it's a bipartisan act before Congress right now that will greatly increase OPIC's ability to operate, particularly in places like Africa. In addition to a few more staff people, we could potentially get equity authority, which will allow us to help projects that are just shy of equity get to that bankability stage. It may involve some grant-making authority, which again would help us move decent projects which are just missing that, if I can pick up on your word, the last mile, last kilometer to bankability. And it will greatly increase the amount of business that we can do. It is bipartisan. There are a lot of obstacles to go through in Congress. It has to be done by the end of this Congress, which I think ends in December. Otherwise, they have to start all over again. But that's a real commitment on the part of Congress, both the Democrats and the Republicans, to build on Power Africa and the Electrifying Africa Act and the reauthorization of AGOA to strengthen the commercial relationship between Africa and the U.S. So there.
Thanks, Peter. We certainly are looking forward to the BUILD Act passing on a bipartisan basis. There are a lot of investors from the U.S. that are here, that are both at this conference, but also those who haven't made it to Mauritius, sadly. And you've seen over the years, Blackstone makes substantial investments in sub-Saharan Africa. KKR has made investments, but has publicly announced that it's going to withdraw, principally because of the lack of size for an investment for a private equity fund like KKR runs. Carlyle is here with offices on the continent. Denham Capital is a substantial investor here, which 10 years ago did not invest in sub-Saharan Africa. Endeavor Energy, they're here today. You can speak with them as well, substantial investors in the power sector. So I think we're seeing a lot. There's a lot more there than maybe meets the eye. But Saria, if you were to suggest one solution for strengthening the U.S.-Africa partnership, what would that be?
Thank you. I would think the analogy of give a little fish and then teach someone to fish. There must be a mixture of short-term and short-term impact, but also targeting on long-term sustainability.
And Richard, how would you accomplish that? How does Power Africa intend to accomplish that? It just seems to make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, Power Africa, again, as Peter was referencing, is a broad toolbox. We have, for example, US TDA, who can come in and provide a little fish in terms of a pre-feasibility study, right? To actually give a grant, do the work, get the development, of that project going. And then the teaching how to fish on the backside will have transaction advisors or legal advisors that will be sitting with the government to be able to help them negotiate better so that the next time this comes around, they won't need the help. They will have done it. They will have that experience. And so, honestly, we're trying to tackle that from top to bottom, from side to side, every way we can, to be able to provide the advisory tools, the technical assistance tools, the financing tools to the private sector, to governments, to utilities, really covering the whole spectrum of opportunities that are in the power sector. So I think we are doing that. What we are doing more of in the future, as I mentioned before, and what Paul referenced, is this focus on the enabling environment. So really trying to focus more on the long term as well, to try and help utilities reform, to help the transmission and distribution side of the equation get built out so that when the generation happens, that can take place.
And maybe to add, I think that is where, again, the packaging of the programs and the communication needs to be improved, because when you talk about Target C in connections, new homes, and Target C in additional generation, the population is believing that they are waiting for the actual switch on of lights. They don't understand the bettering of the environment, the capacity building that is being done so that we fuel the private sector to bring this to fruition. They are looking at, actual, connections. You talk about 1,000 household connected or 1 million household connected. So they are every day asking the policymakers. You made this announcement the other time that 11 million or any million dollars available from Power Africa for connection. So where are the connections? Why aren't you utilizing this money? So they believe there is money somewhere to pick and implement immediately. So I think the communication strategy should also be bettered to ensure that there is a mutual understanding.
Thank you for that point, Zaria. Let me just mention as well, I think what has happened, and I have personally seen this, I mentioned the $7 billion commitment by the U.S. government that accompanied the announcement of Power Africa a number of years ago. I was recently in Zambia, and I was sitting down with one of the heads of ZESCO, and his first question was, so how do we tap into this $7 billion fund that Power Africa has set up? Clearly, there had been some miscommunication. Yes, there is a $7 billion commitment on behalf of the U.S. government, but that is over the course of a number of years, and that is taking the form of MCC commitments, OPIC financing, USTDA pre-feasibility studies, USAID technical assistance that's being provided, all of the above. I mean, we just, for example, signed a contract with 9 different contracting consortiums for an indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract over 5 years for $1 billion. Now, we may not use all of that, but it's there, right? So we are definitely putting money into this. It is feeding through lots of these different channels, but you're right. The person on the ground who hears that may think, wait a minute, where's my connection? To date, we have connected through our calculations and off-grid and on-grid about 50 million people, all right, through our efforts, through our partnership. The other 250 million people that we're trying to reach may have heard the $7 billion commitment and have seen nothing. But the 50 million people who have seen some change in their life. So there's a lot of work on perspective that we need to be focused on. So thank you for your comment.
And that's kind of a backdrop of this conference. Where have we come from, and trying to measure that. Paul, let me ask you a question, and and Enos, please chime in. The U.S. has been a technology leader in many areas, telecom, but also in the power industry. Could you talk a little bit about where you see the U.S. partnership going from the technology side, and how it can be particularly useful in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, I will. For that, I want to add to his fish story.
Okay.
I think you
That's
should
the
add.
theme.
I think you should add at the end of it. Once you've given me my fish, please don't take it back. Right.
Yeah, there is that.
And technology. So this is where I think the United States trumps everybody. Excuse the pun. Because right now you're seeing in renewable space, for example, storage, battery storage, all the great leaps that are being made in battery storage as we speak, and it's only in the last couple of years you're seeing it, are mostly American companies or American companies partnered with European companies. So, for example, Tesla, because of their know-how and experience in cars, they've now installed a battery system in Australia called the Big Battery. And all the reports are, it's a utility scale battery, I can't remember, is it 50 or 100 megawatts or something? And all the reports from the utilities now are fantastic of the effect that this battery has had in Australia. But of course, this is an on-grid thing that is there to supplement the baseload power. So, and in California, you're seeing these batteries being installed there. And there are companies in this room, like Power Engineers, I can see Jack sitting there. What they do is they work under US TDA grants and things like this, which TDA finance. And they can bring those technologies to the continent and figure out where they'll work. The problem Africa's got, of course, is there's not enough baseload everywhere to allow these little peaking situations to exist. But things are changing, and I think you find. I mentioned earlier on when we were in our prep meeting that recently we had people in San Francisco looking at a new type of hydro turbine, which has been invented by a brother and a sister from MIT. It's called Natel. That turbine only needs 2 or 3 meters of head to operate. And so you can put it in a river, whereas normally you couldn't have used that. So what that means to me is that if that technology can be deployed in Africa, so many more rivers can be used than there is today to deliver hydroelectric power. And that's a great thing for off-grid, because then you can have combinations of hydro. And I think at the end of the day, what everybody's looking for is the least cost solution so that the tariffs can be down. The problem with all these technologies is today it's expensive. But in the next 5 years, you'll see these prices come down, like mobile phone prices come down, like solar panels. You're now seeing solar at 6 cents, 5 cents. Scatec told me the other day the 400 megawatt solar plant in Egypt is 7 cents. But these are numbers that nobody ever thought that you'd see in the solar space. So I think there's huge advantages in technology, and I'd urge actually Power Africa to do a lot more. I know they do it already, but there's a lot more going on in the technology space that could be tried and tested in Africa.
What we're seeing in the States on the renewable side, but also in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, excuse me, is pairing renewable energy, principally solar, with battery storage, therefore competing in an off-grid context with baseload power.
Yeah, the problem with
but
that,
the cost issue has to be overcome.
I can tell you about the cost issue because we've recently done some studies on it, but the problem with it today is a lot of countries, or another, Madagascar is one of them, what they'd like to do is to have these, they call them hybrid systems. So they have solar during the day, then they have a battery, and then they have a thermal power plant for the evening. When you actually add up the capital cost of each of these things, and you amortize that over the life of the PPA, the tariff is way high.
Substantial, but what's the cost benefit vis-a-vis base load and additional transmission and connectivity? And what's the opportunity cost where those parts of sub-Saharan Africa can't progress because they have no power?
Yeah,
Right.
you're right. There's a calculation you could make whether or not, to build a 132 kV line out to there, to a small place, is it going to be economic? Probably not. The problem is that the utilities want these solutions, but they don't accept that the tariff is also high.
Oh, I agree. I agree.
That's the problem.
Enos, what have you seen for energy?
Yeah, look, we take a view that technology will probably determine the future of what happens on the African continent, particularly in the energy space. And just to give you, our perspective is this, is that in terms of the relationships between countries that produce technologies and the African continent or the consumer market in which these technologies are applied, the challenge always is about defining the problem and creating the priorities that these technologies need to solve. So a simple example is the provisioning of energy in communities, rural communities where there was no energy before. There is a lot of talk, for instance, about solar panels on the roof to charge cell phones. But if you have lived that life, being in a rural area as I have, you know that the biggest energy requirement in that household is actually cooking energy. And the implications of solving that problem are very significant, not just in terms of you have solved a cooking problem, but you change the quality of life of the women who, it's usually women who have to walk long distances to fetch firewood. You solve the problem of accidents and health problems in the home because of the emissions from fire. And you also begin to take care of the environment within which communities live by reducing soil erosion from the decimation of forests and the ecosystem there. So if you look at that situation and say, if you solve the cooking problem, you now are keeping more women at home where essentially their responsibilities are still there, even if they have to travel to get firewood. They can now focus not only in terms of their responsibilities there, whether you like the environment in which this happens is not the issue, but that is a fact that women have the disproportionate burden. And you then may even provide them an opportunity to improve their lives. So we need to look at technologies and say, we can see the plethora of technologies and a suite of possibilities that is there. Let's bring an African definition to how these technologies are combined and what the priorities in terms of the solutions that need to be implemented would be. And that is something that we are beginning to think about as energy, to say we need to enrich the technology discussion by focusing on doing more research and being a responsible counterpart in the technology conversation and see how we accelerate how these things are done. Simple fact is, if you solve the cooking energy problem, you just plug a cell phone to it. But if you solve the cell phone problem first, it is very difficult to see how you then migrate to the cooking without additional capital infrastructure.
Get the men to do the cooking.
Well, just one or two observations from Peter or from Richard. How does the United States react to the technology changes that are going on in the power space?
Wow, that's not really my bailiwick, because we're looking for commercially tried and proven technologies, so it's harder for us to become involved in financing of
Well, maybe when the Build
energy
Act
market.
passes,
That could
you'll
change.
you'll have a much greater latitude of
But I
investment.
will say we're coming to financial close on a $1 billion concentrated solar project in the Northern Cape in South Africa. And that's going to transform the South African market.
That's
because,
technology.
Yeah, there is a molten salt storage solution. So they actually store during the day using solar and produce energy at night. The tariffs are higher, though. It's not new technology, but it's newer technology. So we're willing to take that kind of risk. But some of the things that have been talked about here, that's really venture capital
Maybe
risk,
a
I
little
think.
earlier stage, and,
Yeah.
and that technology has been proven in the United States.
Yeah.
So
Right.
there is a good track record.
Yeah.
I will just throw in, we do have, through our scaling off-grid energy work that we're doing through USAID and some partnerships with DFID and others, Shell, challenges, grand challenges, where we just recently did one for sort of commercial level refrigeration. Is we're trying to bring, improve energy efficiency so that you can get, better refrigeration products into places, into the hands of people that wouldn't normally be able to afford it. And that was just completed last January with some really exciting new products. So we are looking at trying to foster new technology that way, but we're always open to looking for others as well.
Let me open it up to the audience. Are there any questions for our panel? Yes.
I can use a New Yorker's voice. Thank you. Christopher Marks from Mitsubishi MUFG. Question for Paul. In terms of bringing more American investors into Africa, there's obviously there's the long road option, enabling environment, support, building up capacity. Do you think that there is value in short-term application of American public money in terms of providing risk guarantees, full support the way the IFC did in Zambia, or these sort of wasted signaling exercises, and there is no shortcut?
I think it's difficult to get any organization like OPIC or whatever to provide the level of guarantee. I mean, you can get certain guarantees and partial risk guarantees, but the level of guarantees that independent power producers need, it's not going to come from those. And this conversation's been going on for years. For me, everything is, and let me start by saying, when you go through this process with the lenders, we're in one right now with lenders for Rwanda, you realize that actually the lenders aren't really the issue, because we all know what they want, and there's a certain way of going about satisfying them. And we almost know what their due diligence checklist says. And it's things like convertibility of currency, repatriation of dividends, and things like this. And then you get to the technical part, and then you get the IRRs. What is the IRR? And the lenders are as tough as anybody about what those conditions should be, including the commercial conditions that exist in the PPA. So, for me, I would spend public money working in Africa, helping create that. I mean, we call it the enabling environment, but that's what it is. It means making sure that government and the utility can tick off all the due diligence questions. And invariably what you have, the situation you have is, in Africa, the utilities are technically, on paper, bankrupt. Okay? So then you have, no one's going to make an investment with a bankrupt utility if they don't think that's backed by the government. So you have to have guarantees there, sovereign guarantees and the like. And people say to us, we go and we say we need a sovereign guarantee, and they say, why? You don't need a sovereign guarantee. But the people who are actually asking for that are the lenders, not us. They won't do it without a sovereign guarantee. So where will they do it with a sovereign guarantee? Without a sovereign guarantee? I can tell you where they'll do it. They'll do it in Kenya. They'll do it in Uganda. They'll do it in Côte d'Ivoire. few others, okay? Maybe Ghana now. But the thing about the sovereign guarantee is the reason that they're doing it without the sovereign guarantee is, guess what? Those utilities have a track record of paying their bills. That's why they'll do it with a government of Kenya letter of support or a government of Ghana letter of support or whatever, because those utilities have got a track record. So for me, it's all about working with clients, working with governments in Africa to be able to say to the equity investors and the lenders, look, all that's taken care of. You don't have to worry about it. And then you'll get them. They'll be streaming in. There should be, it's a trickle of investors, even though it's increasing. It's more than it used to be. But it should be a flood. I mean, it's the biggest opportunity in the world for the power sector. So why is it, why are American companies not here in the droves they should be?
Paul, I think you hit the nail right on the head. That's the reason underlying risk. I think we've got time for one more question. Then I know our panelists who are, really interested in this topic will be available for some conversation afterwards.
First of all, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Moka Tayeb, and I am with Power Secure. It's a subsidiary of Southern Company, 50 billion US company. It was a drag. It took me 6 years to convince them at least to give it merit. And I agree with Joe that Power Africa definitely is the key to convince a lot of companies that's not sure about Africa. I am a kid of Africa, and I believe in the future of Africa. My question is to Paul about the fish.
About what?
Why didn't you
The fish.
cook the fish and eat it before they take it back? And what is the lessons that you're giving to cutting-edge technology, U.S. companies that evaluating the situation right now, and they would like to bring some cutting-edge technology to support Africa in affordable, knowing how, and definitely you and I know that we have a lot of solutions that can benefit all the African countries, way more affordable than what they're paying for today. What lesson learned for someone like me evaluating the situation of Africa, and what recommendation you're giving me?
So, okay, if I was you, I
Should
would.
I take the next plane and go
I
back
would.
to Atlanta?
I'm gonna add one. Protect my fish. Right? What I would do is, I would study what's going on in the United States. We do that. We're always looking at what else is happening, and people go and visit factories and things. And as Peter said, OPIC doesn't invest in new technologies. I'm not actually talking about the investing in new technologies. What I'm saying is they're there. They've already got their investors. They've got their venture capital. They're building factories. They're doing things. What I'm seeing right now is a technology leapfrog that I haven't seen for a long time. New things appearing in the market. I thought batteries were going to take a lot longer to come. So what I would do is hunt around and find what those new technologies are, learn all about them, and then try to introduce them to utilities in Africa. Some of them, like I say, that hydro thing, I didn't even know about it until 3 months ago. But it's a great technology for Africa. And there's many things that when you look at what's being produced and then you look at what's needed in Africa, you can say, God, that's brilliant. That would work first class. So that my message is really to Richard, which is if they could take some of those billions of money that they get from Donald Trump and put it into paying power engineers new contracts to go and study them and whatever.
Jack, I know you're all for that.
Yeah. You okay with that, Jack? Yeah.
But no, seriously, there are technologies there. I'm sure, seriously, Jack could probably tell you about many more than I can. But they're there, and they have an application in a situation where half the continent doesn't have electricity. So They may be great for off-grid, they may, whatever.
Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for their really unique perspective, helpful perspective, and invite all of you to surround them as they try to leave the stage and ask any other questions you may have. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello. Sorry, just before we go, as you know, we had our awards ceremony on Tuesday, and unfortunately, we weren't able to give this award, but I'd like to give an award of recognition to Joseph Tato for a long-term support. So thanks very much.
You know, this is just really nice because being a lawyer, you take a butt of a lot of jokes, and I very rarely admit in public that I am a lawyer. But one of the things that's satisfying is that you can do something to help others. And those of us who were early on in Africa saw an opportunity to contribute our skills and our knowledge to make a difference. I tell you, that's as important, and others that I know in this audience, as any professional accomplishment. So thank you very much.